Better late than never. Here is your look at memory. Now, some of you might be really good at memorizing things, other people not so much. So hopefully this quick little lecture will get you better acquainted with some of the tools necessary to be able to memorize some material and be able to really not just spit it out, but really internalize it and understand it, which is going to be really key for some of those big exams you might have to take, including this one. So, what is the whole big deal about memory? The whole big idea is retrieval. When you're sort of sucking all of that information in, the idea is that you have to sort of get it back and get it back quickly. And that is a process called retrieval, which is where you find your information in that large filing cabinet that is your brain, and you bring it up to consciousness. So what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to learn the material in a way that bringing it back up again and rummaging through that filing cabinet will be a lot faster. So, as in all things, we prepare, we organize, we work, we evaluate, and we rethink. So we have to remember the right things, right? Because we can remember all sorts of things, but the key here in college readiness is to remember the stuff that is going to be on the exam. So how do you know what is important? It's different than what can be done. I'm sure you could there might be some of you that can memorize an entire textbook, but will that entire textbook be on the exam? Not necessarily. So one of the things that you should do is check the syllabus and other notes you might have for the sort of big picture of the class. What is the point of the class? What are the things that you should be able to know by the time the class is over, so that those are the things that you focus on when it comes to memorizing things for an exam. Sometimes syllabi will have things like class objectives. Sometimes they might have all of their units sort of marked out for you, so that if there is a textbook, you'll know which places to go directly. Just because you can memorize everything doesn't mean that you should, right? So we gotta be efficient with all of our stuff. So, one way to sort of do it is to personalize your information, relate it to something you know. If I try to do this as much as possible when teaching sociology, for example, some professors might not necessarily do that kind of work, but see if there is any way that any sort of, for example, if you're learning something in psychology, if that reminds you of a character in a TV show, or if that reminds you of something you know, or something you've experienced, or maybe there's a song that sounds kind of like the concept that you're learning about. Maybe you saw a similar storyline to the thing that you're studying in literature. Maybe you saw a similar version of that storyline being played out in a comic book that you read, right? If you can relate it to something you already know and already know well, it is going to be a lot easier to remember it. Also, for some people it might be useful to organize information by place, as in where were you when you learned it. So, for some people, and this might be especially important when we get into our sort of chapter on studying for exams, sometimes it might be useful to think about and use place to better illustrate whatever it is that you're trying to learn. So, for example, you're reading something about maybe game addiction, right? If for psychology, who knows, I don't know, making something up. And perhaps learning that information and maybe going to an arcade afterwards, or maybe playing a favorite game of yours after you're learning it, going to a specific place that is maybe related to it while you're learning it might actually be the key to sort of really bringing things up in your mind, right? So for all of you visual learners, maybe visualizing a place and visualizing that place you were when you learned it might be a pretty cool, useful idea in order to help you remember things. So, how do we memorize things? A key thing is rehearsal. If you have been part of a play, or if you've sung a song before in public, if you've done any kind of public speaking, then you know what it is to rehearse something. So you are practicing and you're learning information in order to transfer it to your memory. And it's not just repeating things over and over, but it's also summarizing things and associating it with information. So when you're an actor, you don't just memorize your lines, you memorize cues. And those cues are really, really important to tell you what it is to say at what point in time, right? So making those associations and making those sorts of summaries is really, really key to being able to have accurate rehearsal. Mnemonics are actually pretty cool. So that's how you pronounce it. Mnemonics, not mnemonics, it's mnemonics. These are formal techniques that make material more memorable. So think back to all of the times you've had to memorize things like the order of the planets, or ways that you can do the sort of classification of animals, like phylum, order, class, kingdom, all sorts of fun stuff like that. Anything where you've had to figure out orders of things or what things stand for. Mnemonics are those things that you used in order to help you remember them, and some of them stick with you to this day. So some examples are acronyms. So you can make words out of sort of key concepts. So for example, our power learning that we have in this class, where we prepare, organize, work, evaluate, and rethink, that just forms a nice handy word, power. So whenever you think of power in all acronyms, you will know immediately what that stands for. So that might be useful for whatever concept you're trying to learn. An acrostic is a sentence. So every good boy does fine is a common sentence that is used to learn the order of the 5 lines in a common staff in music. So every good boy does fine. Those are the notes E, G, B, D, and F. Of course, a word, that would be the acronym, face would correspond to the spaces on a staff line. Another acrostic that I used when I was learning the order of the planets was my very early morning jog starts up near Philadelphia. Of course, now that Pluto is no longer a planet, I need to come up with a new acrostic sentence. Rhymes and jingles might be cool. So maybe you are the kind of person that has maybe a bit of a musical ear, and notice how easy it is for us to remember rhymes and jingles, and how important jingles are to advertising, right? We remember little songs like ba-da-ba-ba-ba, I'm loving it, right? So we can remember that and instantly think of McDonald's. We already know what that song means. So why not use that popular advertising technique to your advantage? Maybe there are things that rhyme whenever it is that you're trying to remember something. Maybe you can make up rhymes about it. Maybe you can make up a little song about it. Hey, whatever it takes to remember something, whatever is going to be useful, do whatever works for you. But think about it. If it's a useful advertising technique and it gets you to remember things like putting Fritos on your sub, then maybe you should get it to work for, I don't know, your chemistry homework. So one cool idea would be, and especially this is true for anybody that has multiple learning styles or multiple intelligences, don't just read the words off the page constantly. Use your body. If you are a sort of an audio person in terms of your learning style, say the words to yourself and think out loud. Stand or sit. If you are a visual learner or a tactile learner, maybe touching or tracing the page. If there is a diagram or some sort of pie chart, that would be useful for you. If you are a visual learner, definitely find ways to draw things out by using concept maps, by putting common things into charts or graphs. If you're trying to learn the water cycle, right, where water evaporates from the ocean, becomes clouds, the clouds become dense enough and heavy enough that rain comes out of them and it flows into rivers and streams and sort of on back to the ocean. You could draw that, and maybe drawing that is way better than listening to the description that I just gave, which is probably incorrect anyway, but hey. And of course, visualization, the formation of images to recall material. And what could be interesting here is that weird is good. If something is weird and you can visualize your material in a very unique way, whether that is, say that you have the different stages of grief in psychology and dealing with grief. Perhaps all of those different stages from denial to anger to bargaining to eventually acceptance, you can sort of think of those as somehow being acted out in different ways. You can visualize those. You can visualize somebody acting out all of those different things. You can visualize if there are sort of maybe different, either different phobias that you learn in psychology, or maybe there are different concepts that you learn in sociology. You can visualize those in a way that will make them easier for you to remember. And if they are weird, and if they are unique, and if that works for you, that might be even better, because it will definitely jump out in your mind. So weird is good. Now, overlearning. That word sounds bad, but no. Overlearning is a good thing. When you overlearn, you are rehearsing and studying something until it becomes automatic. Now, this is key for memorizing something for the purposes of an exam or some other sort of assessment. When we'll get to sort of public speaking and giving presentations, in that case, overlearning is not necessarily a good thing, but that's another lecture. But when you rehearse and you study things until they become automatic, like, you know, your every good boy does fine, like your face, just like my very early morning jog starts up near Philadelphia, Roy G. Biv, all sorts of fun stuff, right? You can just sort of spit those out now, and that's because you overlearned them. It's a good thing. So you rehearse, you study until things become automatic to you. So how do you figure out whether or not you remembered something correctly? In pretty much most textbooks, they will have questions at the end of chapters, and some of them will even include practice exams. Use those. Use those and test yourself. In fact, you can have a friend or study group test you. This is a great thing about study groups. This is a great place to sort of use them to your advantage, is if you can test each other to see whether or not you've memorized a certain thing. So not only to study together, but also to test your knowledge. So have a friend or study group test you. And another actually really cool thing is, say that you have a parent, a friend, a partner, somebody that is removed from your class and isn't necessarily taking the class. Have them ask you what it is that you learned. Have them ask you what it is that you know about a certain subject. If you can teach someone who has no partial knowledge, and you can teach someone and they can understand it, that means that you have truly internalized the information. So even beyond just being able to spit out names and dates, if you can teach someone, that is how you know whether or not you've actually internalized something. So that would actually be kind of useful. So use your parents and little sisters and everybody as sort of guinea pigs. If you can teach your cat about power learning, then you know you've done your job. So, key things to remember about memory. We're sort of rethinking memory, which I think is kind of cool. There is memory consolidation. This is sort of an actual physical thing that happens in your brain, where physical links between brain cells become fixed and stable. So memory is not established the first time we learn it. These are things that happen over time, which is why you need to start studying and internalizing this stuff pretty much at the point where you're taking notes. After you take notes on something, reread them, review things. If you get a discussion question back, keep rethinking and reviewing those, because the first time you learn something, you're not going to remember it unless you have some sort of really cool photographic memory or anything. That's why if you cram for an exam, like you're literally studying everything all at once the night before an exam, that's not going to work as well. As much as you think, oh, it's going to be fresh in my mind, not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to actually remember anything, right? Memory is an ongoing process, and if you know that there are certain things that you're going to need to know for an exam, and this is especially useful for all of you AP folks, right, where you have this big exam moment, you have to start early in the process, because doing stuff the night before, not necessarily going to work as well. Cool. So I hope you enjoyed this sort of brief look through memory, and I hope that this sort of helped you kind of get focused on all of the important things you need to learn. See you next week.